My name is Delaney Shore, and for most of my life, I thought being the strong one meant staying quiet, keeping the peace, making room, never needing much. I was the one who didn't cause trouble, who nodded and gave and let things go. But there comes a point when letting things go means losing yourself. And one day, without planning to, I stopped. Stay with me through the end of this story. Then tell me, did I do the right thing? Would you have done it any differently? I'd really like to know. It was a rainy Sunday in early March when my family came to see my new place in Seattle. Though if I'm honest, I should have known that nothing about that visit would go the way I hoped. I still remember the patter of raindrops against the window, the kind that makes you feel both cozy and a little foreboding at the same time. That day, as the overcast sky blurred the cityscape, I welcomed my parents and my sister into what I had fought so hard to build. My name is Delaney Shore, and at 42, I've spent more than 2 decades learning to stand on my own. I work as a lawyer at Hawthorne Legal Group, a job that has tested me in ways I never imagined, yet also made me fiercely independent. I chose to live alone, to keep a sense of control over my life, even if that meant accepting a tinge of loneliness. Moving into my new apartment in Capitol Hill wasn't just about finding a roof over my head. It was a statement, a declaration that I could carve out a space for myself in a world that often demanded I shrink to fit into someone else's expectations. The apartment itself is bright and meticulously arranged, a perfect reflection of my years of perseverance and sacrifice. Every piece of furniture, every carefully chosen artwork on the walls, tells a story of late nights and early mornings. I had envisioned this space as a sanctuary, a place where I could finally feel the fruits of my labor. Yet, as the rain fell softly outside, I couldn't help but feel a subtle unease brewing beneath the calm exterior. I had invited my parents, Wayne and Celeste, and my younger sister, Tasha, hoping for a peaceful family lunch where I could share some personal news I'd been holding on to. Tasha, at 35, has always been the golden child, the one who attracts attention wherever she goes. With nearly 300,000 followers on her social media, she's an influencer in every sense of the word. The moment she stepped through my door, her phone in hand, she was busy recording a live story, her voice bright and filled with an excitement that always seemed to be at odds with the heaviness in my own heart. My mother, Celeste, wasted no time in showering Tasha with compliments. "Oh, baby girl, you look absolutely stunning today," she gushed as Tasha twirled in a chic outfit, her phone still recording. In stark contrast, when she turned her gaze to me, her tone shifted abruptly. "Delaney, how much did this place cost you?" she asked, her words dripping with a subtle hint of criticism. My father, Wayne, remained quiet for most of the visit, his occasional interjections laced with an undercurrent of disapproval. At one point, he casually mentioned, "Do you even drive that fancy car anymore?" His eyes flicked to Tasha as if to say that certain privileges were meant for someone else. As lunch was served, a meal I had painstakingly prepared in my own kitchen, the conversation slowly took on a familiar pattern. Tasha chattered excitedly about her upcoming wedding in Mexico, a celebration funded largely by a luxury wellness brand. "I need to detox before the big day," she declared, her voice light and carefree. My mother nodded in agreement, adding, "You know, you've always been the one who needs a little pampering." Her words, though meant to be affectionate, stung like a cold reminder of how I had always been overlooked. I sat there quietly, my hands wrapped around a glass of wine I had chosen specifically for this occasion. I had planned to share the news of my recent promotion at work, a moment I had looked forward to celebrating. But every time I tried to speak, the conversation was effortlessly hijacked by discussions about wedding plans and the latest trends in detox retreats. I couldn't help but notice how the topic of my own achievements was brushed aside, as if my success were something trivial compared to Tasha's glamorous life. Throughout the meal, I felt an insidious pressure building inside me, a feeling that I had been pouring my heart and soul into this family for so long, only to be rendered invisible. I caught myself glancing at the empty spaces on the table where my words should have been, my dreams and aspirations sidelined in favor of superficial chatter. It was in those fleeting moments that I wondered, what else have I been giving to this family all these years, just to fade into the background? The rain outside seemed to echo my inner turmoil, each drop a quiet testament to the years of quiet sacrifice and unspoken pain. I tried to smile, tried to engage in the conversation, but the insincerity of it all left a bitter taste in my mouth. I felt as if I were living two separate lives, one defined by professional achievements and personal growth, and the other mired in the expectations and judgments of those I once believed loved me unconditionally. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself standing by the kitchen counter, the bottle of wine still in my hand. I looked out the window at the rain, feeling an inexplicable mix of resignation and defiance. In that moment, with the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the soft murmur of the rain as my only companions, a single thought resonated in my mind. A question that had been building up quietly, waiting for the right moment to surface. I remember standing there, holding that bottle, and I couldn't help but ask myself, what else have I been pouring into this family all these years, only to be invisible? The question lingered, echoing in the silence, as if the rain itself were urging me to acknowledge the truth, that perhaps it was time for me to reclaim my voice, to step out of the shadow that had long been cast by others' expectations. That day, as my family continued to chatter about the trivialities of wedding plans and detox retreats, I realized that the time had come to confront the subtle, corrosive imbalance in my life. Even though I was surrounded by the familiar faces of those I loved, I felt an overwhelming loneliness, a solitude born not of physical absence, but of emotional neglect. And as the rain continued to fall, I silently vowed that one day soon, I would no longer be invisible. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the sky was still a dull gray, like the world hadn't quite made up its mind about letting the sun back in. I was running a little behind schedule, trying to shake off the emotional residue of the day before. My head still echoed with bits of wedding chatter, spa talk, and the strange silence that filled the spaces where my voice should have been. I grabbed my work tote and headed downstairs to the garage beneath my building. I had a routine: get in the car, coffee stop on Mercer, then off to Hawthorne. It was my small slice of control in an otherwise unpredictable world. But that morning, when I turned the corner toward my reserved spot, the space was empty. My first thought was, I must be on the wrong level. So I double-checked. Same number on the pillar. Same markings. Just no car. I stood there for a long minute, staring at the void, trying to will the car back into existence. Then I walked up to the front desk and asked the concierge, Alan, if there had been any towing reports or maintenance work over the weekend. He glanced at the logbook and said, Actually, your vehicle was removed on Friday, signed off by someone named Wayne Shore. My heart sank. That's my father, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, they didn't feel real. They felt like betrayal, dressed up in paperwork. Alan looked apologetic. I assumed it was prearranged. I nodded slowly. Yeah, so did I. Back upstairs, I dialed my father. He picked up on the second ring. Morning, kiddo, he said, cheerful, as if he hadn't just stolen a $60,000 vehicle from me. Dad, I said carefully, I went down to get my car. It's gone. There was a pause. Then, the most nonchalant response I've ever heard. Oh yeah, that. I figured since you weren't using it much lately, it'd make more sense to free up the space. My jaw clenched. You sold it? He didn't answer right away. Then, it's not like we just dumped it. Got a good price. And Tasha really needed the retreat. She's been under a lot of pressure lately, you know. Before I could respond, I heard my mother's voice in the background. She must have been on speaker. Honey, she said, her voice in that soft, dangerous tone she used whenever she was about to justify the unforgivable. Tasha's been anxious. That spa retreat helps her balance her hormones. You know how sensitive she is. And you're doing great. You don't even need that car. You have Uber, don't you? I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. It wasn't just the car. It was the principle. It was the absolute gall of taking something that was mine without even asking. The assumption that I had so much, I wouldn't miss it. That I was so strong, I didn't need care, or respect, or even basic courtesy. The BMW had been my first real splurge. I bought it after winning my first major case, an elder abuse suit that nearly broke me. That car was more than metal and leather. It was a symbol of everything I'd earned, everything they had once told me wasn't possible for someone like me. And now it was gone. Casually reallocated, like I was a safety net they could just bounce off whenever life got tricky for Tasha. I hung up without saying goodbye. My hands trembled as I walked to my kitchen table, opened the drawer where I kept important documents, and pulled out the original paperwork from the dealership. And there it was. My mistake. Clear as daylight. Co-owner, Wayne Shore. I'd let him co-sign when I first bought the car to save on taxes. I thought it was harmless. I thought it was smart. I thought I could trust my family not to use that as a loophole to steal from me. Turns out I was wrong. I sat down on the floor, leaning against the cabinet, feeling stupid. Not just angry, stupid. Because I had known this was the kind of thing they did. I just didn't think they'd do it to me. Not like this. Not now. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to call them back and unload 20 years of swallowed hurt. But I didn't. Because deep down, I knew exactly how that conversation would go. They wouldn't understand. They never do. They'd say I was overreacting, that it was just a car. That family is about giving, not keeping score. That I should be happy Tasha was finally getting her life together. But where did that leave me? That evening, after spending the whole day going through motions at work like a ghost in a blazer, I stopped by the Birch Cup, the cafe on my block. I didn't go there often, mostly on weekends. But that night, I just needed to be somewhere that didn't carry the weight of my last name. Nico Bram was there, as usual. Same seat by the window, same notebook open in front of him. He always looked like someone who'd lived 100 lives, but didn't feel the need to talk about any of them. I must have looked wrecked, because the moment I stepped in, he raised an eyebrow and said, "You look like someone who needs a table, and a break from pretending everything's okay." I gave him a tired smile and slid into the seat across from him. "I lost something today," I said quietly, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic of the coffee cup they brought me. He didn't ask what, just nodded, like he understood the kind of loss that wasn't always tangible. "Maybe it's time to stop pretending you didn't," he said. And I let that thought settle. I didn't argue with it. I didn't explain it away. I just sat there, listening to the clink of spoons and soft murmur of strangers, and let myself feel the weight of what had been taken, without permission, without apology. And somewhere deep inside, something small and quiet began to crack open. The next time I saw Nico, he was sitting in his usual corner at the Birch Cup, sipping black coffee and scribbling in that worn leather notebook of his like time moved differently in his world. I slid into the seat across from him without asking. He looked up, nodded once, and didn't say a word. "I'm still angry," I said, not even sure if I was talking to him or to myself. "Not about the car." "Okay, yes, the car. But not just the car." He waited. "They took it," I said, my voice low and tight. They didn't even blink, like it was normal, like I was being difficult for not just letting it go. He exhaled slowly and leaned back in his chair. "When my brother took my share of Dad's inheritance," he said, "my mom told me he needed it more. Just like that. Like fairness was optional. That's when I stopped expecting justice from blood." I looked at him, startled. There was no bitterness in his tone, just a kind of worn-out truth that had stopped trying to defend itself. I didn't say anything. I just nodded, because I understood that kind of tired. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, watching its slow rotations like it could sweep away the memories circling my brain. I started remembering things I hadn't thought about in years, like the time I turned 10 and didn't get a birthday party because Tasha had the flu. Mom said it wouldn't be fair to celebrate while your sister is sick. I spent that day in my room with a store-bought cupcake and a used book Dad forgot to wrap. Or the time I got into law school and the first thing Mom said was, "But who's going to help your sister with her move?" Even when I bought my first car, they warned me not to show it off too much around Tasha. She'd been going through a breakup and was in a fragile place. I had spent my entire life making myself smaller so Tasha could take up more space. I called it love. I told myself I was the strong one, that they leaned on me because I could handle it. But maybe that was just the story I told myself to feel better about being invisible. The next morning, I called my mom. I didn't rehearse. I didn't make a script. I just pressed her name and waited. She picked up right away. "Sweetheart," she said, "I've been meaning to call. Did you get some sleep?" "I know about the car," I said flatly, "and I know you didn't ask." There was a pause. Then she sighed. That long, tired sigh she used whenever she wanted to make me feel guilty without raising her voice. "Delaney, you don't know what your sister has been through. She's finally getting her life together. She's under so much pressure with the wedding and the sponsors and—" "She took my car, Mom." "You make it sound so cold," she said, her voice starting to shake. "We just thought, well, you've always had more. You don't need it the way she does. And you know how hard it's been for her since—" "Since when?" I snapped. "Since she didn't get into her dream school? Since she broke up with her boyfriend in 2016? Since she got tired of working and decided to post skincare videos for a living?" She went quiet. "You didn't even ask me, Mom," I said, quieter now. "You decided. Again. Like you always do." She sniffled. "Don't be like this, Delaney. You've always been so good, so steady. Don't let something small turn you into someone else. You're not petty." I almost said I was sorry. I felt the words rising in my throat, automatic and familiar. But I didn't say them. I hung up. The next day, I went back to the Birch Cup. Nico was there again, scribbling in his book like nothing in the world could rush him. I sat down, and before I even said hello, I told him everything. The call, the guilt, the part of me that wanted to take it all back just to keep the peace. The other part that was so tired of making peace with people who never made room for me. He listened without interrupting. When I finally stopped talking, he set his pen down. "Sometimes," he said, "you think you're arguing over a car. But really, you're asking if you ever mattered." That hit me harder than I expected. I looked away, blinking fast. "I was 42, I said quietly. "A homeowner, a lawyer, and still a daughter waiting for someone to say, 'You've done well. You deserve to be treated right.'" Nico didn't say anything more. He just sat there with me, in that little corner of the cafe, where the coffee was strong and the truth didn't need to be loud to land heavy. I left that morning knowing two things for certain. The car was gone, and so was my ability to pretend it didn't matter. It started with a text from Tasha. No greeting, no softening. "Hey, Mom says you're expected at the family planning brunch next Saturday. It's mostly for the wedding, but she wants you there to represent our side. You know, give input on colors, layout, maybe write something nice for the program. Represent our side." I stared at the screen like the words might rearrange themselves into something less ridiculous. I hadn't been asked, just assigned. It didn't matter that I hadn't been involved in the planning, or that my last meaningful conversation with Tasha was her justifying why she needed my car more than I did. What mattered was optics, family unity, the illusion that we all sat at the same table when decisions were made. I typed back, "I'll think about it," and hit send. Not even a full minute passed before my phone lit up again, this time with a call from Mom. "You'll think about it?" she said, no hello, no pause. "Delaney, the brunch is next week. The whole family's coming. It's important." "I know," I said, "but I'm not sure I should be there." Things still feel unresolved. Oh, honey. Her voice dropped into that familiar mix of pity and pressure. You're not still upset about the car, are you? We've moved past that. Don't ruin what should be a happy moment over something so small. I held the phone a little tighter. You moved past it. I didn't. There was silence, then a sigh that felt like a door closing in my face. Don't make a scene, Delaney. This is Tasha's time. Don't be the one who can't let things go. There it was. The thing I'd feared all my life, dressed up in soft tones and maternal disappointment. If I set boundaries, I was the problem. If I spoke up, I was the disruption. If I wanted to be treated with the same respect I gave, I was making a scene. I didn't reply. I just said, I'll let you know, and hung up. That night, Nico and I walked down to the waterfront. It was getting warmer finally, the kind of evening where the breeze carries a little salt, and everything smells like quiet and driftwood. I told him about the brunch, about the text, the call, the way my mother's voice could still shrink me down to that 10-year-old girl with the uneaten birthday cake. He didn't interrupt, just waited until I finished, then said, You ever notice how the people who call you difficult are the same ones who only liked you when you said yes? I smiled, but it felt tired. I keep thinking, I said, that if I could just explain it right, they'd get it. They'd understand why it hurt. Nico looked out over the dark water, his hands in his coat pockets. I used to do that, he said, in my marriage. Thought if I just stayed calm enough, helpful enough, gave up enough of myself, I could keep it together. I turned to him. What happened? He gave a half shrug. I woke up one day and didn't recognize my own voice when I said, I love you. That's when I knew I'd been silent too long. We walked a bit more. I didn't say much. I was too busy thinking about how long I'd been quiet, too. Later that night, I sat at my kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. I took out a pen and a piece of stationery I'd been saving for something meaningful, and I wrote, Dear Mom, I've always tried to be the good daughter, the one who understands, the one who doesn't rock the boat. But there's something I need to say. I poured it all out, about the car, the brunch, the years of feeling like an accessory to someone else's story, about how love shouldn't feel like an unpaid debt. When I finished, I stared at the letter for a long time. Then I folded it once, twice, and tore it into pieces. I knew she wouldn't read it. Not really. Not with an open heart. Some people only hear what fits the version of you they've already decided on. The next morning, I got a call from Camille. Camille had been my roommate in law school. We hadn't spoken in a while, not for any reason, just life. But she always had a way of calling when I needed someone to remember who I used to be. I heard the big news, she said. Senior counsel, huh? That's incredible. I'm so proud of you. Thanks, I said. I hadn't told many people yet. You sound tired, she said. I am. Come stay with me for a few days. Port Townsend's quiet this time of year. You can walk the beach, eat too many carbs, not think about anyone else for once. I laughed softly. Camille, I'm fine. She didn't budge. Del, you've always been the strongest person I know, but even strong people need somewhere to breathe. After we hung up, I stood in the middle of my apartment, holding my phone like it might still speak. And I thought, maybe she's right. Maybe the best way to be a daughter isn't to keep folding myself into their version of what that means. Maybe the best way to be a daughter is to stop begging to be seen as one. By the time I reached Camille's place in Port Townsend, the air already felt different. The kind of different that isn't just about location, but something quieter, steadier. Her cottage sat on a slight hill that overlooked the water, sunlight catching on ripples, trees creaking softly like they knew secrets I hadn't figured out yet. Everything about it seemed to say, slow down, you're safe here. Camille had always been the kind of person who thought 2 steps ahead. She'd stocked the guest room with clean sheets, a stack of books, a candle labeled driftwood and sage, and a little handwritten note on the desk. Rest first, talk later. I slept for 12 hours straight that first night. The next morning, We sat on her porch, sipping coffee, and watching gulls dive into the shallows. So, she said finally, like someone flipping gently to the next chapter, want to tell me what really happened with the car? I shrugged. It's not that dramatic. Her eyebrow rose. Delaney, I've known you since you lived off gas station coffee and saltines. Try again. I let out a soft laugh and exhaled. Okay, they took it. Dad sold it, technically, without asking. Said Tasha needed the money for a spa retreat before her wedding. Mom backed him. They called it a small thing, like it was nothing. Camille's face didn't change. She just stared out at the waves, lips pressed. Then she turned to me. Wait, was the car still in your name? Joint ownership, I said. I never removed his name from the title after he co-signed years ago. She set her mug down slowly. Delaney, you're a lawyer. I know. You work in property and contracts. I know. She shook her head. Then you also know that what he did, selling a jointly owned asset without your knowledge, is conversion. That's unlawful. You can sue him. I went quiet. The idea hadn't really crossed my mind. Or maybe it had, somewhere deep in the fog of frustration and resignation, and I'd buried it before it could fully form. Sue my father? I asked. Seriously? She leaned forward. You're not suing your dad. You're enforcing a boundary that should have never been crossed. Think about it, not as revenge, not even as reparation, just as a record. Something that finally says, this happened and it wasn't okay. I looked back at the water. A boat drifted across the horizon, almost lazily. I felt the wind brush past my cheek, and for the first time in a long while, I let the idea sit with me, like a rock in my palm. Solid. Real. My whole life, I'd been trained to avoid making things messy. Keep the peace. Let it go. Don't upset Mom. Don't confront Dad. Don't do anything that might make Tasha feel less than special. But they'd crossed a line, not just once, over and over, and I'd let them. I'd taught them it was okay. Maybe Camille was right. Maybe it was time to put something in writing, not for them, but for me. That afternoon, I sat at the little desk she'd set up, sunlight spilling through the curtains. My laptop hummed quietly. I opened a blank document and began typing. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't angry. It was factual. It laid out the shared ownership, the unauthorized sale, the estimated value of the vehicle, and the demand for acknowledgement. If not financial, then legal. My fingers shook a little as I typed, but my spine didn't. And when I hit save, something inside me clicked into place. I forwarded the draft to a colleague at Hawthorne. Not someone too close, but someone I trusted to handle it with neutrality. I asked for it to be reviewed and filed formally. By the time dinner rolled around, I hadn't told Camille yet. I just sat on the porch with a bowl of lentil stew, listening to the waves and the occasional clink of her spoon against ceramic. You did it, didn't you? She asked eventually, without looking at me. I nodded. Yeah. We didn't say much after that. She just poured me a second glass of wine and handed me a blanket. That night, before bed, I stood barefoot on the wooden floor of the guest room and stared out the window. The tide had gone out, revealing wet sand and scattered shells like tiny echoes of something deeper. And I thought to myself, not loudly, not triumphantly, but with a quiet certainty I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't asking for justice. I was asking for a record. That for once, something that was taken from me would have to be answered for. It started with a subject line. R.E. Formal Notice of Asset Conversion Claim sent at 9:04 a.m. 2. Wayne Shore, Celeste Shore. I didn't write it myself. My colleague at Hawthorne drafted and sent it from his professional email. The message was clinical, careful, and clear. My father had sold property without legal consent from a co-owner, and I was seeking acknowledgement and financial restitution. I watched the email go out. Then I closed my laptop and walked down to the beach. It took less than an hour. Tasha emailed me first. One sentence. No greeting, no punctuation. Are you seriously doing this to me? I didn't reply. By late afternoon, my phone rang. It was Mom. I knew it would be. I didn't want to answer, but I did. Because I was tired of being afraid of the sound of her voice. The second I picked up, she launched in. I cannot believe you, Delaney. I cannot believe you would drag your own father through a legal process like this. Over a car. Over something so petty. Her voice was shaking, but not with sadness, with fury. The kind that came from entitlement being challenged. You have no idea what this is doing to him, she continued. You've always been the smart one, the calm one. What happened to you? I closed my eyes. You took what was mine, I said quietly. And you didn't even ask. She ignored it. You're tearing this family apart. And for what? You've always had more. You always come out ahead. Your sister needed help. I wasn't asked. Because we knew you'd make it about yourself, like you always do when someone tells you no. That one landed like a slap. The projection. The way she flipped the script so fast, I almost forgot why I'd called her at all. I said nothing. She started crying then. Loud, theatrical sobs that I'd heard too many times before. The kind meant to manipulate, to reset the power balance in her favor. I raised you better than this, she choked out. I don't even know who you are anymore. And that's when I realized something. She never really did. I ended the call without another word. That evening, I sat by Camille's old writing desk and pulled out a clean sheet of paper. I didn't want to type this part. I needed to feel the scratch of the pen on the page. I didn't address it. I didn't sign it. I didn't plan to send it. I just wrote, You took what was mine. And for once, I need you to know it's not okay. I'm not asking for the money. I'm not trying to punish anyone. But I'm tired of letting things slide, of pretending your decisions don't have consequences just because you're family. My silence has never meant agreement. You just told yourselves it did. When I finished, I folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer. Not to forget, but to remember. The next day, my cousin Lee texted me. Your mom posted in the family Facebook group, said you're suing them over a car, said you've changed. I didn't respond right away. I stared at the message for a while. It felt surreal, like watching someone else's life explode from the outside. She was shaping the narrative, making sure the rest of the family saw me not as someone setting a boundary, but as the unstable one, the selfish one, the disappointment. That's the price, I thought. That's the cost of no longer being quiet. And yet, I didn't feel regret. I felt strangely calm, like I'd finally stepped out from under something heavy. Around sunset, my phone rang again. This time, a number from Seattle. It was Nico. I heard, he said. Figured maybe you could use a voice that doesn't think you've lost your mind. I didn't say anything for a second. Then, finally, thank you. You're not crazy, he said. Most people wouldn't have the nerve to draw the line that clean, especially not with family, but you did, and it matters. That's when the tears came. Not the angry kind, not the shameful kind. The kind that come when someone sees you, not for what they want you to be, but for what you actually are. And still stays. I cried with the phone pressed to my ear, and Nico didn't interrupt. He just let me. The next morning, I woke before the sun. I walked down to the shore with a cup of coffee, wrapped in one of Camille's oversized sweaters. The sky was a soft wash of lavender and gray. Gulls wheeled overhead. The ocean breathed in and out like it had nowhere else to be. And I thought about how my whole life, they'd called me the stable one. Maybe they meant predictable, quiet, convenient. Not anymore. They showed up on a Thursday afternoon, unannounced, but not unexpected. Camille knocked gently on the door to the guest room, where I was half-dressed, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at a mug that had gone cold in my hands. Her voice was calm, but careful. Your parents are here, she said. They called from the road about an hour ago. I told them it was your choice whether or not to meet. I nodded. My throat was dry, my stomach tight, But my hands? Steady. It's okay, I said. Let's just get it over with. We met at a small cafe near the shoreline, just a 10-minute walk from Camille's house. It was the kind of place that smelled like burnt toast and sea salt, where the mugs were always mismatched, and the windows held the ocean in soft, foggy glass. I got there early, ordered nothing, and sat at the far table by the window, facing the water, not the door. The tide was in. The waves were restless, foaming at the edges like something held in too long. I watched them move, over and over, trying to find rhythm in their chaos. They arrived on time. When I saw them walk in, I stood, not out of politeness, but instinct. The child in me still flinched toward formality, toward old habits that said, don't make this harder than it needs to be. But this time, I didn't drop my eyes. I didn't twist my hands or offer that tight-lipped smile I'd perfected over decades of trying to make discomfort feel polite. I just nodded and sat back down. They joined me. My father sat across from me, his coat still damp from the drive. He looked older, smaller, not in body, but in stature. Like someone who had lost control of a story he thought he was still writing. My mother sat beside him. Her face was a mask of poise, but I could see the cracks, tiny twitches at the corners of her mouth, the way she clutched her handbag like it was an anchor. None of us ordered anything. It was just a car, my father said, after what felt like hours of silence. I raised you. I figured I'd earned a little trust. His tone wasn't harsh, but it wasn't soft either. It carried something sharp under the surface. Wounded pride, maybe. I held his gaze. My voice, when it came, was low, measured. You didn't raise me to disappear, I said. You raised me to clean up the messes no one else wanted to admit existed. You raised me to keep peace, even when it cost me my dignity. I'm done with that. He blinked. Just once. But it was enough to see that my words had landed. Mom leaned forward, her voice already trembling. This isn't how family acts, she said, her hands curled tight in her lap. We don't drag each other through the mud. We don't involve lawyers. We talk. We forgive. We move on. I looked straight at her. No hesitation. No, I said. This is how someone who finally respects herself acts. Someone who's done swallowing her voice so other people can stay comfortable. She flinched, not from volume, but from certainty. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out a manila envelope. I placed it gently on the table between us. It's not a lawsuit, I said. There's no demand for repayment, no threats. Just a statement of what happened, an acknowledgement. You sign it, and this ends here. No press, no escalation, just truth, on paper. My father's jaw clenched. He didn't look at the envelope. Neither did my mother. It sat there like a piece of evidence they refused to see. What's that supposed to prove? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. That I'm not invisible, I said. That what you did wasn't okay, and that I'm not pretending otherwise anymore. We sat in silence for a long time, long enough to hear the soft clatter of forks from the back kitchen, the creak of the front door as another customer stepped inside, shook off the cold, and passed us by like any other family. Finally, my father leaned back, arms crossed. We're not signing anything, he said. We're not criminals. You don't have to, I replied, slowly standing. But you can't come back into my life unless you do. My mother gasped. Delaney, please. I slipped my coat over my shoulders. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. And I wasn't crying. This isn't revenge, I said, steady and soft. It's clarity. You've had your version of the story for years. But this time, you don't get to write mine. I left the envelope on the table. It didn't matter whether they touched it. As I stepped outside, the wind hit my face like truth, salty, sharp, uninvited, but clean. The sky had opened up, gray and vast and honest. My hair whipped across my face, and I let it. I didn't look back. The door shut behind me with a soft thud. Final. Quiet. I didn't win, I chose myself. And that, finally, was more than enough. That morning, the sky wore a pale gray hush, and the world outside Camille's windows moved in slow, sleepy rhythm. I woke just before dawn, not because of a nightmare, not from anxiety, but simply because I had rested enough. My body stirred naturally, as if it had finally remembered what it felt like to wake without dread. I pulled on a sweater, still warm from the radiator, and padded into the kitchen barefoot. The floorboards creaked under my weight, familiar and forgiving. I made coffee the way Camille did. Slow, intentional. The French press method she claimed was the only kind that respected the beans. I added a pinch of cinnamon, then carried the mug out to the porch, its heat rising in gentle curls. The air was cool and damp, touched by the lingering mist that had not yet burned off the ocean's edge. I sat on the top step of her wooden porch, tucking my feet beneath me, and looked out at the wide stretch of silver-blue water. The tide had gone out, leaving tide pools glistening like forgotten mirrors. My phone didn't buzz. No one called. No emails blinked across the screen with urgency or blame. For the first time in months, maybe longer, I didn't feel the need to brace myself before checking messages. I just sat there. And slowly, something loosened inside me. Something that had clenched too long. Later that morning, an email arrived from the attorney handling my claim. The tone was dry, neutral, exactly what I'd asked for. No response from the other party. Will consider the matter closed unless instructed otherwise. I reread it twice, then typed a quiet reply. No further action, but I want the file archived. I want it to exist somewhere. I didn't need money. I didn't need them to say sorry with their teeth clenched or their pride bruised. What I needed was this. Proof. That something had happened. That I had drawn a line. That I had stopped pretending. Around noon, my phone lit up again. This time, it was Tasha. I stared at the name for a moment, then answered. Not because I expected anything from her. Just because I was ready. Her voice was small, tired, but not fake. I guess you hate me now. I didn't rush to comfort her. I didn't smooth it over. I told her the truth. I don't hate you, I said. I just stopped sacrificing myself to protect your feelings. There was a pause. Long, but not heavy. Then she said, okay, and hung up. No defense, no apology, just silence. The kind that felt final. And oddly enough, it didn't wound me. Not everyone would change. But I had. And that was enough. Later that day, Nico drove over from Seattle. He brought blueberry tarts in a paper box and 3 old novels he said I'd like. He didn't ask how things had gone, didn't mention my parents. He just set the box on the table and sat beside me on the porch like he'd always been there. We ate in silence, watching the gulls skim the water. At one point, he looked over and said, "You're not alone. It just takes time to believe it." I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to. That evening, I made a trip into town. Nothing fancy. Just a small, locally owned dealership run by a retired couple who treated every customer like a neighbor. I found a 2012 Subaru. Clean, steady, nothing flashy. The paperwork was quick, the title clear. It wasn't the car I used to drive. It wasn't sleek or loud. But it was mine, fully and finally mine. And that felt like power. Back at Camille's house, I sat at her desk, thumbing through registration forms and insurance docs. That's when a memory came back. One I hadn't invited, but didn't fight off. I was 8. It was my birthday. I'd wanted a doll, a particular one I'd seen in the store window for weeks. Lavender dress, yellow shoes. I talked about it every day. But that morning, it wasn't wrapped. It wasn't waiting for me. It was already out of the box, in Tasha's arms, because she had cried harder than I had. Mom knelt beside me and said softly, "She's younger. You're the big sister. You understand." I hadn't. But I nodded, swallowed it, told myself that love meant giving up what I wanted so someone else could smile. Now, all these years later, I whispered to no one in particular. I was 8, and no, I didn't understand. That night, Camille and I sat on the deck, legs wrapped in a blanket, a bottle of wine between us. The stars hadn't come out yet, but the sky was beginning to open. She looked over and asked, "You thinking about going back to Seattle?" I nodded slowly. "Not to pick up where I left off," I said. "To begin something else." She didn't press. She just smiled and let the silence settle between us like an old quilt. Before bed, I walked down to the beach alone. The sand was cool beneath my sneakers, the breeze strong, tousling my hair into knots I didn't bother fixing. I didn't think about work or family or what came next. I just walked. There was no apology, no reckoning, but there was truth. And sometimes, truth is the beginning of peace. I don't know if you've ever reached a moment like that, when the quiet you've carried for years finally asks to be heard. Not with anger, not with blame, just with truth. Maybe that's all any of us really want, to be seen, without having to shrink ourselves first. If this story reminded you of something in your own life, I hope you'll sit with it a little longer. And if it brought you comfort, or clarity, or even just a sense of being less alone, I'm grateful you were here. If it spoke to you, I'd love for you to join me again next time. There's always another story waiting to be told.